Welcome to our first edition of the podcast on climate change and melting poles. We are here with our Dr. Kristoffer Aalstad, researcher at the Department of Geosciences of University of Oslo. Thank you very much, Kristoffer, for joining us for this interview.
Thank you. It's my pleasure.
So, Kristoffer, our first question is, how do you think that the currently existing international organizations have addressed the problematic of climate change?
Yeah, so this is, of course, a big question. I would say that, as always, the answer is kind of, it depends how you want to evaluate that. So on the one hand, I think organizations like the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, they have done a good job of raising awareness about climate change and also communicating the science that is otherwise kind of locked up in peer-reviewed journals and can be difficult for policymakers or other stakeholders to understand. So in that sense, they have been very important. On the other hand, I think that it's maybe not always helpful that there is kind of a large gap between what scientists know is happening and has been happening for a long time and is very likely that trend is going to continue, and how policymakers act on that, and putting another kind of, even if it's supposed to connect those two worlds, it maybe doesn't always do that, because there's a lot of bureaucracy and there's a lot of competing interests. Not so much in the IPCC organization itself, but maybe more in the different nations that are represented there, and that have a small say in what's agreed upon in the summaries and so on. Yeah, it kind of depends. I guess it's better to have one than not to have one. An IPCC, definitely, but they could do better, maybe.
Thank you so much, Kristoffer. So our second question is, some writers argue that certain international organizations behave differently once they are created, and that in some cases they act autonomously in ways unintended by the states at their creation. So how do you think that organizations like the IPCC or the WMO, the World Meteorological Organization, have behaved in this regard after their creation?
In other words, do you think they reflect the interests of the member states, or on the contrary, act as autonomous actors following their own agendas?
Yeah, again, this is a really good question. So once more, I would say it depends. If by reflecting the interests of the member states, if you mean the citizens of the member states, or you mean special interest groups within the member states, if you mean the majority of member states, or what, because there will always be, maybe I shouldn't name any names, but there will always be certain states that have competing interests to maybe an organization like the IPCC, or at least climate science, or what climate scientists would recommend. For example, oil-producing nations may not like that the causes of global warming are tied so closely to petroleum exploration and use of fossil fuels. So they may want to kind of not censor, but maybe lighten some of the language to avoid being blamed for certain things. Whereas other countries, maybe certain island states in the Pacific, they may want much stronger language, and they may want more global responsibility from wealthier nations that are the ones actually consuming a lot of these resources that are leading to climate change and its impacts. So, yeah, it's kind of a complicated question, I would say. But I think in the sense that they are communicating, at least I'm now talking mainly about the IPCC, but in the sense that the IPCC is able to communicate the state of the science, I would say they are reflecting the interests of citizens of the member states, most member states, especially if you take into account future generations. Yeah, if that's good. As for the WMO, I think they definitely reflect the interests of most of their member states, because through the WMO, it's much easier to coordinate global meteorological observing networks, which means that weather forecasts around the world are a lot better, because neighboring countries can use each other's observations, which will improve their weather forecasts. And as you probably know, things like weather doesn't really have a border. It's not like a rain cloud will suddenly stop at the border. It will continue over to the next country, right? So you need the information from your neighbors, and you need some central organization to coordinate that. And I think they're doing a good job at that. So.
Yeah, to echo the voices of developing countries too.
Yeah, exactly. It's very important.
So, Kristoffer, to what extent do you think that control over technical expertise and information at the IPCC or WMO accounts for their independence from member states?
Yeah, this is kind of what ties into the answer to the last question, because just like I think it was the last question, just like I said there, I mean, a lot of the policymakers, they won't have the detailed technical or scientific knowledge to be able to understand a lot of the issues that, for example, the IPCC deals with in great detail. So in that sense, this is kind of why these organizations were created, right? Because it's a way to collect all the evidence and all the studies that have been done over the last years, and kind of synthesize that knowledge. So I think that this kind of both the technical expertise and the information that they are kind of synthesizing plays an important role in how these organizations are in some sense independent from the member states that they represent. Because if a member state could go in and like say specifically, okay, we don't want you to do this or talk about this, then yeah, it would change the dynamic of how both of those organizations work.
So some theories relate the causes of international organization dysfunctions to the pursuit of material interest within the organizations, others to a state preference and constraints, others yet to an external environment, and finally, others to internal organization cultures associated with the organization's. So according to these theories, where would you locate these functions in the IPCC or WMO?
Where you could have dysfunctions is in state preferences, and this comes into what I was talking about, that maybe some countries have a strong interest in not having regulation for certain fossil fuels, and their continued use and development and yeah. So yeah, I don't want to name any specific countries because that's probably a bad idea, but I think that can be a problem, and kind of in a way you have this false balance then, because what can happen is that an organization like the IPCC, in when they create their summary, they, as far as I know, all the countries represented have to agree on the summary, and so then it can be that even if just one country disagrees on a point, that can be enough to change the wording of that summary. It doesn't mean that the conclusions of the report as a whole changes, but it means that the summary, which is maybe what media or someone could use more superficially, that could end up changing, which is unfortunate. That's the only thing I'm really aware of that's really possibly a bit dysfunctional, but that ties in more to these organizations having their roots as kind of international or intergovernmental organizations rather than what they're actually doing, because geopolitics is really complicated, basically.
Thank you so much, Kristoffer. So our last question is, so organizational engagement refers to when an international organization participates in another regime. So have you seen any remarkable organization engagement between either IPCC or WMO and different regimes? And do these organizations cooperate with other organizations in different aspects out of their main scope? Let's say refugees, for instance, or migration.
I mean, certainly the topics covered by at least the IPCC are highly relevant to many other organizations, I guess, within the United Nations framework, for example. So refugees would be an example. I don't know enough details about if there is actually ongoing collaboration between IPCC and UN organizations like the what are they called? You would know this better than the UNHCR or something like that. Yeah. But I mean, certainly in the next decades and at least in the next century, if things continue business as usual, then one of the biggest climate impacts will be large migrations of people from parts of the world that can become almost uninhabitable or very to the current agriculture there. And those people would then be forced to move, or at least wars could erupt, and it would trigger refugee crises. And I think there has been some work suggesting that part of the Arab Spring and the civil war in Syria had to do with a failed crop season and things like that. So I think such things will get worse, and it's important that these organizations cooperate with each other. But it's probably even more important that the individual member states start to take these problems more and more seriously, and that people understand that even if it doesn't benefit them in particular to do something about these problems in the short term, then in the long run, this is something everyone has to address together. So it's a problem of collective action, which is why I think it's such a challenging problem for the international community to deal with.
Yeah. So thank you very much, Dr. Aalstad,